Panzanella is an Italian bread and tomato salad that makes for a fast and easy meal. This version is designed to maximize on tomato flavor, even when tomatoes aren't at their peak in winter. We're going to be using roasted and sun-dried tomatoes, as well as garlic, basil, capers, homemade croutons, and then topping everything off with burrata, the extra decadent cousin to mozzarella. Panzanella is an inexpensive and impressive recipe and makes a great addition to your cooking repertoire. Panzanella is made up of 3 major components, and we'll be adding a 4th to round it out into a meal. The first is the bread, 2nd, the tomatoes, 3rd, the dressing, and then 4th, we're adding in the mozzarella or burrata, which will add in protein and take this from being a first course to a main meal. The first component, of course, is the bread. Panzanella is a bread salad. It was designed to use up day-old stale bread, so the bread to everything else ratio is flipped on its head from a typical salad. The type of bread you use is pretty flexible, but I would recommend staying away from anything that's too soft or too sweet, like a brioche or potato bread, or bread that's hard or dense, like a nut or seed loaf. Ideally, you are going to want to have a bread that has a nice crunchy crust and a soft spongy interior. This is for 2 reasons. The first is that your salad is going to be much more pleasant to eat if it has textural contrast between a crunchy crust and that soft, tender interior. And the second reason is that you're going to need to toss your bread with relatively wet ingredients like the tomatoes and the dressing. And if it doesn't have the structure to withstand those wet ingredients, it's going to disintegrate underneath the dressing, which will just make for a disgusting salad. White breads like baguettes, ciabatta, sourdough, or those round loaves of country bread all work really well here. We're going to toast this bread to help it dry out. If the bread is drier, it can soak up more of those juices from the tomatoes and from the dressing without becoming soggy and losing its textural contrast. Before we put that bread in the oven though, let's talk about our tomatoes. Panzanella salad would only ever be made with perfect top of the season summer tomatoes picked right from the garden. But we'll have to work with what we have. We're going to be employing a few different tricks to maximize the flavor of our tomatoes. I'm working with less flavorful greenhouse winter tomatoes, so we need to get creative with how we're going to make sure that we can really punch up that tomato flavor. First, we're going to cut and salt the tomatoes ahead of time. The salt is going to season the tomatoes and draw out their water, which will help to concentrate their flavor. Then we're going to roast the tomatoes in the oven on low heat with some olive oil and garlic to help further concentrate their flavor. Roasting is also going to caramelize the naturally occurring sugars in the tomatoes, giving them a richer and sweeter taste. To streamline our oven time, we're going to give the tomatoes a 15-minute head start on the croutons. Then we are going to use oil-packed, sun-dried tomatoes, which have an incredible concentrated tomato flavor. Tomatoes contain a lot of umami, and as you dry them, the sweetness in those tomatoes intensifies, and the umami concentrates as the water evaporates out. Pair that then with the oil, which basically acts as a vehicle for the umami to your taste buds, and you have a single ingredient that contains a massive amount of flavor. You can tell the tomatoes are done when they have shrunk down and started to become jammy and a bit browned. The bread should be crusty, but not crunchy all the way through. A simple olive oil and balsamic vinegar is a perfect dressing to complement summer tomatoes, but since we're working with less flavorful tomatoes today, we're going to punch it up with some stronger flavors like capers, shallots, basil, mustard, and roasted garlic. Since this recipe features so much bread, which is a neutral flavor canvas, it's going to help temper the sharpness and acidity of the dressing, bringing everything back into balance. Roasted garlic has a nutty sweetness that you just don't find in raw garlic. The sweetness of the roasted garlic is going to help highlight the sweetness and flavor that we're coaxing out of our tomatoes. By adding the tomatoes into the dressing a bit in advance, we are giving our tomatoes and dressing time to let their flavors marry together. The longer it sits together at room temperature, within reason of course, the better the end product is going to be. And room temperature is key here. Taste is 80% smell, and a cold tomato is not releasing as much fragrance as a warm tomato or a room temperature one. So the warmer your tomatoes are, the more flavorful it's going to be. Burrata is one of my favorite foods in the world. It's very similar to mozzarella, except that instead of being solid all the way through, a burrata is basically a sack of mozzarella containing a core of heavy cream and cheese curds. If you can't find burrata, however, mozzarella is still a great substitute. This is one case, however, where you may want to spend a little bit more to get a high quality mozzarella. I will admit that if I'm making a pizza or using it for melting, I tend to go for the cheapest mozzarella. But in a dish like this, you will really be able to taste the difference between a bottom of the shelf mozzarella and a higher quality one. To finish our salad, we're going to toss all of the components together. The tomato and dressing mix, the croutons, chopped fresh basil, and 2 cups of arugula. Then topping each plate with a half of the burrata or mozzarella. Recipes, there are 4 criteria I'm mentally rating the dish on. How easy is it to find the ingredients? How expensive is it going to be? How simple will it be to make it? And is this something I can scale up and use to feed a crowd of people? So here's how I would rate this dish. Burrata is the only thing in this recipe that might pose a slight challenge, although most well-stocked grocery stores carry it these days. If you can't find burrata though, I guarantee you can find mozzarella and the rest of the ingredients just about anywhere. Bread, tomatoes, cheese. This is not an expensive dish to make. That being said, this is one of those recipes where better quality ingredients will deliver noticeable results. So if you want to spend the money, buy the good olive oil, the quality cheese, the nicest tomatoes, the artisan bread, etc., and wait for your mind to be blown. If we were making a more traditional panzanella, the only cooking that would be required in this recipe is making the croutons. Roasting the tomatoes and garlic adds in a bit more work, but it's fairly streamlined since you can do it alongside the bread. Aside from that, it's just chopping, mixing, and assembly. This is a very easy dish to make for a crowd. If you want to make it for a party, I would use mozzarella ripped into bite-sized pieces and tossed straight into the salad. The only drawback about the salad is that it doesn't keep very well. You can prepare it ahead of time by prepping all of the elements, but keeping the bread separate until just before serving. Unfortunately, however, leftovers aren't going to be as good the next day since the croutons will have lost their crunch. Check out the recipe in the video description below, and don't forget to hit like and subscribe to stay posted on more recipes and videos. I'll see you next time.